South Australia has a very promising future. From the beginning, there were glowing accounts of the province that was to be, its climate, its resources, the sound principles on which it was founded. But all of this is dependent on its people having the intelligence and the discretion to elect leaders who are there for the benefit of the colony and not for the benefit of themselves. Happily, in my life, my education was something I took for granted. I grew up in Scotland, which is... I see I have some fellow clans people here. Good afternoon to you. Scotland has quite a distinctive educational system from neighbouring England, and we were taught that literacy was our right and that access to art is our heritage and not at the behest of patrons and collectors. This then is a way of forging a people who will settle for nothing less. I count myself well educated. I was fortunate in my parents and in my society. Here in South Australia, I see women and children who are not so advantaged, and it is the responsibility of those of us who know better to pass these advantages onwards. It was through these sentiments that I embarked upon my first career, my first stage of life here in South Australia. Aged 17 years old, I became a governess. I had the attention of my charges and I could begin to expand their minds. But I longed to speak to more people. This led to the second stage, writing. First through poetry and short articles published in the South Australian newspaper. I had to report under my brother's name, John Brodie Spence. He became a leading banker and politician, but in those days apparently a woman should not have productive thoughts. The same thing happened with my first novel. I was interested in writing fiction that incorporated the social and economic conditions of the time. I've been labelled as the first woman to publish a truly Australian novel, and that was Clara Morrison, A Tale of South Australia During the Gold Fever.
Great read.
Thank you. It told the story of a young woman making her own way in the world of early South Australia. Shocking. Equally shocking to your ears today may be the fact that I even had to publish the book anonymously. It would seem that along with journalism, novel writing was not something in which a young gentlewoman should be engaged. I also went on to publish 2 further novels, but both had my name firmly attached to them. But it was my interest in the plight of our young people that brought me to the third stage of my life. I worked with others to establish the Boarding Out Society, to take young delinquent people out of institutions and place them with families to be fostered, and so obtain a proper chance of a good and productive life. On October the 30th, 1840, when I was 15 years old, an election took place at the Beehive Corner, just a few streets away from here. It was to elect members of the Municipal Corporation for the City of Adelaide. It was the first local government election in Australia, and it was also the first public election in the world that used a primitive form of proportional representation, where those men entitled to vote could form groups or quorums to elect candidates. At that time, my father, David Spence, was the town clerk of the Corporation for the City of Adelaide. He took the time to explain the election to me, and this did spark a lifelong interest in how we might best allow people to be fairly represented in the ballot. I am sometimes accused of having only one idea, that of proportional representation. But really, I have so many ideas. The reason why I insist so much on a change in electoral methods is that I believe a real representation of the whole people, and not of a mere segment of the people, is the key to unlock the doors for all other reforms. First, secure that the people are equitably represented, and then see what earnest, conscientious people can do. Effective voting, or proportional representation, means that instead of elections being decided by majorities in small districts by which nearly half of the votes are wasted, All of the votes are to be used in large districts, and the representatives are returned in proportion to the number of voters who hold certain opinions all over the enlarged constituencies. Proportional representation is not just about minority representation, but it is necessary to establish genuine majority representation. If we exclude the intelligent and the wise from our federal, state and municipal councils through our systems of voting, and retain the first-past-the-post system, where the successful candidate is no more than the winner of an outright popularity contest, it will exclude intelligent and conscientious minorities, and the whole balance of our democracy will be overthrown. There is no answer from any single minority group to fix this. Even the women's suffragists who fancy that they have the votes and use them, they will moralise politics. But will they? As soon as it is seen that the earnest, conscientious women have votes and use them, will not the party politicians induce all the women whom they could command, cajole or corrupt to register as voters, and the result is that the votes for these interested men will be swelled by the votes of the women, and the adverse majority would only be the larger. Therefore, I have said all along that the women's suffrage and proportional representation should go together, or the first will be a mere delusion. Yes. Being a woman, and therefore, at the time, disenfranchised, I considered myself to be in a unique position, where my efforts could be considered to be independent and without undue interest towards any parties. My thoughts on effective voting or proportional representation became even more solidified when I read a review in a magazine on Thomas Hare's book. It was called A Treatise on the Election of Representatives, Parliamentary and Municipal. The book was only slightly longer than its title. But the review called it the most important work ever written on the practical part of the subject. I was inspired. I devoured any material I could find of Mr. Hare's work on this subject. I wrote a pamphlet called A Plea for Pure Democracy, Mr. Hare's Reform Bill Applied to South Australia. My brother John encouraged me to do so, and in fact he paid for the printing of 1,000 copies. It cost £15. Mr. Hare's system on which I based the pamphlet was later implemented in Tasmania and known as the Hare-Clark electoral system. However, let us just say that given the lukewarm reaction to my writings on this matter, I did not set the Torrens on fire. On a somewhat positive note, though, it was said overseas that Mr. Hare considered the pamphlet the best argument from the popular side that had appeared. Once I had gained my confidence, I proclaimed that henceforward, for any woman who felt she had something to say, to stand up and say it. This audacity of stepping to the fore began to take on some popularity. Within a year, Robert Barr Smith, also a native Scot, a philanthropist and a partner in the great South Australian film firm Elder Smith & Company, he financed a public campaign for electoral reform. Within a year, I had travelled 3,000 miles and spoken to more than 50 meetings throughout South Australia. Excellent. We even used mock elections to show how proportional representation worked. And from these 4,000 votes that were collected, the newspaper, The Register, conducted a public count in its pages. I then left Adelaide and I travelled extensively. I campaigned in Britain and in America for electoral reform, and I earned enough money through my lectures, nearly 100 of them, to support myself on the proceedings. Though sympathetic to the cause, I had always been regarded as a weak-kneed sister by the real workers. I had failed to see the advantage of having a vote that might leave me after an election as a disfranchised voter instead of an unenfranchised woman. I had, after all, felt that with or without women's votes, it was only with proportional representation that the full will of the electorate would truly be known. Although I was gratified that it was kindly said that my support, through being one of the vice presidents of the Women's Suffrage League, my reputation would have increased the credibility of the movement. When it became apparent that the Federation of Australia was on the horizon, I attempted to persuade our Premier, Charles Kingston, to adopt proportional representation to elect the 1897 Federal Convention. Of course, it had already been successfully introduced in Tasmania, but it was not accepted in our own state. For this reason, I decided to join the fray, and I stood for election for the Federal Convention, thus becoming, as a byproduct, the first female candidate in an Australian political election. I put my nomination in only at the last minute to avoid anyone trying to derail me, and I triumphantly came 22nd out of 33. No matter, they could not ignore me now. I am glad that I have lived to see women gain the vote in our state in 1895, and indeed, and again in federal elections in 1902. These are important milestones along the way to fair representation in our society. From my days as a governess in the nursery and classroom, speaking to only one or two children, to my days on the podium, addressing the great and the good throughout the Western world, I have only sought to speak so that others might hear and join efforts to spread the message of fairness in representation, in equality and equity for all. In political matters, as in all other things, let us seek righteousness and justice, and many other good things will be added unto us. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a fine speech by Miss Spence.